The post-Cold War era, explained by me, a nerd. Post meaning basically after in Google's definition, and cold meaning at a relatively low temperature, and war meaning a state of armed conflicts between different nations or states or different groups within a nation or state, also in Google's definition. And era meaning a long period of time, also in Google's definition. Put those words together, and then you get the post-Cold War era. And what does it mean? The post-Cold War era is a period of history that follows the end of the Cold War. And now you might be like, what is the Cold War? Well, we will get to that in a sec. The Cold War was an era where two global superpowers, the United States and Russia, were in a race against each other. Actually, there were multiple races, including the arms race, space race, race for a better economy, the race for technology and resources, and influence over other countries. And lastly, the race between communism and capitalism. Now, when I was young, I thought that the Cold War was just about nuclear weapons and who was more powerful. But then I figured out it was actually because of the United States and the Soviet Union's different ideas, which were communism for the Soviets and capitalism for the Americans. Now you might be wondering what communism was. Well, communism was an idea made by Karl Marx, who had an idea for people to overthrow their greedy and wealthy bosses and for the workers to share amongst each other as equals. For example, red marker and blue marker and yellow marker all want a piece of bread, but there's only one, so they would each take 1/3 of the bread each. This is an example of what the Soviets tried to achieve and what communism was thought to be about. The Soviets liked this idea so much that they tried to expand this idea, and that posed a threat against capitalism. Capitalism was almost an entirely different idea from communism. Capitalism meant for bosses to keep control over the workers, and even though it does not seem fair, it was used by most of the Western world, which is basically Europe and North America. Capitalism would create jobs, but would keep one side poor and the other side rich. Here's an example. Yellow marker is the boss of We Make Markers, and red and blue marker are working for yellow marker. Blue and red marker create new markers and get incomes of $4 per year. Yellow marker sells these markers for $10 per marker. This is a basic example of capitalism. Also, a basic idea for the human trafficking business. Now you might be like, how does communism and capitalism affect each other? Well, communism is basically saying for red marker and blue marker to overthrow yellow marker. And it was basically asking for people to overthrow capitalism. And capitalism was in place in the West and in the world since the Industrial Revolution, and most countries did not want to change. Communism and capitalism basically rivaled each other throughout the Cold War, but eventually the Soviet Union fell, and the United States became the #1 superpower. The Cold War affected the post-Cold War a lot in political terms and in economic terms. Now that the USSR, the Soviet Union, was gone, the United States had more capabilities than it had before, since there were no longer any more rivals, and the United States would not have any more rivals for the next 30 years. This gave the United States an advantage over other nations and others who wanted to oppose the US. The United States now had the power to police and influence nations, specifically the Middle East. And one country that the United States would attempt to police is Afghanistan. And yes, I said attempt. Now, why would the United States have a problem and try to police Afghanistan? Well, we have to go back to the near end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union's powers were diminishing. It was December 24th, 1979. The Russians invaded Afghanistan in an attempt to support the Communist Party in Afghanistan, and helped fight with the Communist Party in Afghanistan against the rebels known as the Mujahideen, which were backed by the West and the United States. The Mujahideen was also supported by multiple other Muslim and Middle Eastern organizations and countries. One Middle Eastern organization was Al-Qaeda, but we won't talk about them for some time. Eventually, thanks to all the help the Mujahideen got, they were able to defeat the Communist Party and the Soviets after 10 long years. The Soviets withdrew out of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was now at peace. Except, it was not. Instead of gathering together as a group to help rebuild Afghanistan, multiple organizations in Afghanistan tried to take over the weakened government and decided to fight each other for power over Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was in ruins again. But then in 1996, a new group that had captured the capital, Kabul, and killed the current Afghan president had come into power, the Taliban. The Taliban broke multiple human rights laws and did some terrible, terrible things. So bad that I can't even say it here, because if I do, this video is going to get shut down. Well, let me just tell you some. They did. Most of these violations were against women. Eventually, the Taliban would make good ties with, you know who? Al-Qaeda. They were so friendly with each other that the Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to create terrorist camps and training facilities in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was run by a man named Osama bin Laden, who did not like the United States. Why? The United States influenced nations that Al-Qaeda wanted to influence, mainly in the Middle East. So Osama bin Laden had an idea that if he attacked the Twin Towers, which was America's trade center, and many other important locations in the US, such as the Pentagon and most likely the White House, that would force America to withdraw its influence out of countries that Al-Qaeda wanted to influence. And they would do this as stealthy as can be. Now you might be wondering, what was the Twin Towers? The Pentagon, or the White House? Well, we will start with the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were located in New York City, in Manhattan, and it was built in the World Trade Center. There were two towers, the North Tower and the South Tower. Both towers had 110 floors. The Twin Towers were the embodiment of the U.S. economy and were a major part in the United States economy. The Pentagon was the embodiment of the U.S. military and was a place where the U.S. Army officers would meet. The Pentagon was shaped like a pentagon, and it is one of the biggest offices in the world. And the White House is known as the House for the President. Osama bin Laden thought, again, if he attacked these sites, then America might withdraw out of these countries that Al-Qaeda wanted to influence. But America knew that terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda would happen. They just never knew how deadly it would be. It was September 11th, 2001, at 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time. The North Tower was hit. Then at 9:03 a.m. Eastern Time, the South Tower was hit. Then at 9:37 a.m. Eastern Time, the Pentagon was hit. The White House could have been hit, but the passengers on the plane knew something was fishy and started to try to take control of the plane, as they thought that Al-Qaeda had the control over the plane and was heading for the White House. Eventually, a fight took place, and the plane crashed into Pennsylvania. Evidence shows that Al-Qaeda did have control over the plane and was heading for the White House. But how did these towers and the Pentagon get attacked? Well, Al-Qaeda used suicide bombers. People from Al-Qaeda would hijack these planes and fly them into their targets, acting as guided missiles. These planes had people, so the people on the planes died too. Less than a month after the 9/11 attacks, President George Bush declared war on Al-Qaeda and asked for the Taliban to hand over Al-Qaeda officials in Afghanistan. The Taliban said no, and this forced America to go to war with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Osama bin Laden would not be found until 2011. On 2011, he would be killed by the U.S. Navy SEAL. The war would not end until October 30th, 2021. there will be thousands of deaths lost. That's the end of the video, and hope you enjoyed. Thank you. And please support this channel by subscribing and clicking the like button. Thank you for all your support.